A lot of delegates don't know what a crisis committee is, especially if they come from the GI and have never experienced it. And this is a question that's been asked for a long time, so hopefully these videos will be successful in illuminating what a crisis committee is and dispelling that mystery once and for all. So, what is a crisis committee? Well, when you think about what a crisis committee is, you need to take what you've learned about GA, 75% of that knowledge, and throw it out the window, because crisis committees generally throw rules of procedure out the window anyway, and it won't be very helpful. Rule number 1 of crisis committees, just roll with it. If they're weird, just roll with it. So, in a crisis committee, one of the first big differences is that you're not going to be representing a country, or you're very unlikely to represent a country. Generally, you'll be instead representing a character. For instance, you can be a member of President John F. Kennedy's cabinet during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and let's say you are Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. That will be your title. Instead of a country, you are Robert McNamara. You can even say the words I. Your speeches don't have to be like you're representing a country. They can be more informal and more passionate. Crisis committees generally center around at least one major event. So for this example, the obvious major event is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. One thing about crisis committees is that you have to remember that they don't usually follow the historical record. It would be easy to get sucked into the trap of reproducing the Cuban Missile Crisis. But crisis committees, because of the way they're oriented, are much more loosely structured. And if your committee actually follows history, it wasn't a very fun committee. And you probably didn't do much as a character, because your character should become powerful enough to actually be able to change the shape of committee itself. Committees can even be fantasy committees. So staying true to historical record isn't very important. It's important to know, but it is not the goal of a crisis committee. Crisis committees don't exist in a vacuum. This is how they can diverge from the historical record so much if they're historical crisis committees. Instead of a GA in which you're static in a room with no other outside world, crisis committees have an outside world, and you can and should mess with it and use it to your advantage. That said, it will also mess with you. The crisis committees' crisis updates are a result of this outside world. A special conference staff called the crisis staff will control essentially what the outside world is and how it responds to you in committee. So the way they communicate this is through crisis updates. So you can be in the middle of a moderated caucus, and as soon as the caucus ends, or even an unmoderated caucus, virtually at any time, actually, crisis staff can enter the room to deliver what we call a crisis update. This can come in the form of a news report, it can come in the form of a short skit, it can even come in the form of an interrogation, and sometimes even a trial or an execution. So for the Cuban Missile Crisis, an example of a crisis update would be a military report coming in saying that U.S. forces have intercepted a USSR shipment of nuclear warheads going towards Cuba. And then the committee will take that information, someone will propose a moderated caucus to debate the information, and draft something called a committee directive. Committee directives are plans that are drafted and voted on by delegates in the committee to deal with crisis updates that reach the committee room, which we will call the front room. I'll get more into that later. So committee directives are the closest thing you'll find to a resolution in a crisis committee. Committee directives are your resolution on how to address a crisis update. So, for example, in your crisis update where a warhead shipment was intercepted going to Cuba by the U.S., committee will say, motion for a moderated caucus to debate the crisis update. That's a common motion in a crisis committee. And someone will draft a plan on how to deal with that. So we'll say one delegate drafts a plan called Not Cute Cuba, they usually have funny names, and says that we should implement a quarantine or even a blockade. But for the sake of example, we'll just go with a quarantine. So we'll say the U.S. is establishing a quarantine, and then the committee directive will also detail in bullet point form, not resolution form, what that plan would look like. The committee directive will circulate the room, You'll give speeches on it, you'll merge it with other committee directives, it'll go up to the chair, and it'll be voted on by committee. If the committee directive passes, then crisis staff will come back into the room. They may or may not deliver another update. They will take the committee directive to a place called the back room, which is where the crisis staff live. And in the back room, they manage the outside world and generate new crisis updates and determine where this chain of events is leading. So they'll take your committee directive that says to establish a quarantine, and they will figure out how that quarantine is impacting tensions. They're going to say, is it effective? Did the ship start turning around at the quarantine? Maybe the ship's barreled through. Committee will come back in with a crisis update to the committee and say, a crisis update. 3 USSR freighters have blown through the US blockade of Cuba. And this is like a response to the directive that had been passed in committee to show that you are impacting the outside world and the outside world is impacting you back. So I've told you about what crisis updates are and the fact that you're going to be representing a character and that things can happen. The reason things can happen is because you are not in a general assembly in which you are in a static room with no outside world. Crisis committees have an outside world that you can and should interfere with and use to your advantage. Crisis committees have a timeline. So in your Cuban Missile Crisis Committee, one rogue discovery will build upon itself. So it'll be like you are in the Cuban Missile Crisis with a series of updates that escalate and escalate. As a delegate, you will also have abilities to create orders that will go to the outside world through personal actions called personal directives. Personal directives are secret and they are only for you, unless someone is surveilling you through their own personal directive, which is something that you can do as well, but we'll get into that later. So through your personal directives, you can access the world outside the committee room. This means that while your character, Robert McNamara, may be sitting in the committee discussing what to do about a quarantine, you can also be sending personal orders to secure private warehouses, hire bodyguards, and even try to assassinate other delegates. So your personal directives are short orders that you give or letters that you write to people that you have created outside of your committee. So for example, if you are McNamara, you can write a directive, a personal directive, maybe a letter to your wife. If you've established spies elsewhere, you can write to your spies. You can launch a secret recruitment campaign to find double agents. You can do virtually anything with your personal directives. You can attempt to steal missile launch codes, you can hire bodyguards, you can launch investigations, you can work with other delegates to try to assassinate someone. You can start your own company. You can try to get involved with laboratories and develop research projects to get yourself extra resources. Personal directives should build upon each other to give yourself more resources and more power to influence committee. You can also work with other delegates to create what's called a joint personal directive in which you combine your powers. So if you're Robert McNamara and you're the Secretary of Defense, well, your chances of, say, contaminating the food industry with a hallucinogenic or something, they're very low. But if you work with someone who's working in the health department, then your chances are much higher. You can write that in a joint personal directive. Crisis staff will occasionally come into the room to collect your personal directives and take them to the back room, which is the same place where the committee directives have gone. Your character will have all of your personal directives and your joint personal directives kept track of and managed by the crisis staff. So there will actually be a long, sort of a list of index cards containing information on what your character has done. Your crisis personal directives and joint personal directives should feed into something called a character arc. Character arcs are a series of directives and events that you use to advance your character towards a goal. In the back room, your character's character arc will also be weighed against other characters' character arcs. Sometimes you're trying to get the same resources that somebody else is. Sometimes you're actively working against or with other delegates. All these things will be taken into consideration in the back room and should keep them in mind when you're writing your personal directives. You want your character's actions and crisis arc to be contained in the crisis updates that the whole committee debates on. Your goal isn't to do what the committee wants, and it's not to stick exactly to your character's goals in real life if you have a historical character, or even a present-day character. Your goal is to amass power and influence the flow of the committee. So I've talked about what the crisis staff are, what a crisis update is, what a crisis committee typically looks like. They're usually very small, only 15 to 20 delegates. I've discussed personal directives and joint personal directives, and what the back room is in a nutshell. All of these things have to happen at the same time. You have to be building your character arc at the same time that you're giving constant moderated caucuses. In the flowchart, you will see that crisis committees are essentially in a perpetual state of moderated caucuses, drafting committee directives, voting on committee directives, and receiving new crisis updates. So all of these things have to happen at the same time. If you stop writing in a crisis committee, you are done. You will need to be writing while giving notes to other delegates, while giving speeches, and drafting and even merging and amending your committee directives. In a crisis committee, there's no time to breathe, there's no downtime, and it's super fun. So, hopefully, you have a little bit of an idea on what a crisis committee will look like.